You know, in the great scheme of global conflicts, the First World War has never really had that much attention from Hollywood, and I guess when you consider how it was begun and conducted, it's kind of easy to see why. Unlike World War II, there were no clear-cut villains to be defeated by flag-waving, cigar-chomping patriots. The culture and technology of the time was so radically different from today that it's difficult for audiences to relate to, not to mention that everyone who fought in it is long since dead and gone, and the largely static, stalemate nature of trench warfare doesn't exactly lend itself to the kind of fast-paced, run-and-gun action that people look for in war movies. Instead, the First World War often gets used as a metaphor for the pointlessness, inhumanity, and futility of a war that feeds men into an uncaring meat grinder, or as the backdrop to a goofy but well-meaning superhero movie, or as the gory, mud-soaked location of a horror film where people get ripped apart by fucking barbed wire. The point is, not many people have tried to tell a more conventional story about this semi-forgotten war, presenting it as it was and allowing audiences to make up their own minds. Well, not until Sam Mendes directed 1917 at least, and fuck me, he came good with this one. I just got back from seeing it last night, and I was so impressed that I needed to put together a review as soon as possible. And not just any old review, this calls for another episode of The Drinker Recommends. So now we've got that out of the way, let's get into why I love this movie so much. 1917 focuses on two young infantry soldiers stationed on the Western Front, named Blake and Schofield. They're resting up behind the lines when they get summoned by their commander for an urgent mission. It looks like the Germans have withdrawn from their trenches on the other side of no man's land. Assuming that they're retreating and the war is as good as won, the Brits have sent a couple of battalions forward to kick their ass. But it turns out they were wrong. The Germans have actually moved their troops back to a much stronger defensive line a few miles away, and the Brits are due to run straight into it at dawn the following day. In short, 1,600 men are about to get annihilated. This is bad news, and clearly something needs to be done. The trouble is, it's 1917. It's not like they have mobile phones or radios. The only way to communicate with them is to deliver the orders personally. Blake and Schofield are given a simple but vital mission. Find the commander of the unit by dawn the following day and tell him to call off the attack. The clock is ticking, and if they don't get there in time, the entire unit will be wiped out, including Blake's brother. So the bulk of the movie follows these two characters on their epic journey, from the squalor and desperation of their own lines, through the mud and wire and decaying bodies of no man's land, the sinister darkness of enemy bunkers, and the deceptively peaceful countryside beyond, the ruins of devastated towns, and finally to the site of the doomed assault on the German positions. And along the way, they witness both the horror and the humanity of one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. I'm not going to say much more about the story here, because honestly, I don't want to spoil it for people. This isn't the kind of review where I'm going to pick apart every aspect of the plot and break it all down, so instead, I'm going to touch on the more general stuff that really stood out for me. The first and most obvious thing about this movie is the cinematography. 1917 is presented as a single continuous shot from beginning to end, allowing us to literally follow every step of our character's progress as if we're right there beside them. Now, I'm not the kind of critic that spunks all over things like scene composition, colour palettes, or camera angles, but Jesus Christ, even I can appreciate the sheer amount of work and effort that went into something like this, both from the production crew who had to set everything up, and the actors who had to keep it all going. Yeah, clearly there were actual transitions in filming, and if you look closely, you can see where the camera pans across something insignificant to end the scene and give the actors a break, but for the most part it's practically seamless, and the effect is unlike anything I've seen before. The sets look incredible, perfectly capturing the horror and misery of trench warfare. The mud, the flies, the soldiers huddled over pathetic little fires, the rats everywhere, the rusting barbed wire and the squalid dugouts. Everyone looks fucked and exhausted and pissed off. This is a place that no sane person would ever want to be, and it only gets worse from there. Like when our characters slither into water-filled shell craters in no man's land, finding themselves surrounded by rusting equipment and half-buried bodies, decaying relics of previous battles. Some of them are recent, but others have been there for months or even years. It's a stark reminder of how little the front lines changed on the Western Front, how millions of young men fought and died over a strip of poisoned, blasted, shell-covered mud a couple of 100 yards across. It's awful and heartbreaking, and you can't take your eyes off it. Or a nighttime scene where the ruins of a destroyed town are lit by the occasional flare overhead and the orange glow of a building burning off in the distance. It's a nightmarish landscape of ruined walls and collapsed rooftops that looks like the aftermath of a nuclear war, and it almost defies belief that humans could inflict such destruction on a place. But even amongst the horrors of war, there are still tiny slivers of humanity to be found, like a young woman caring for an orphaned baby in the basement of a destroyed building, or a company of soldiers listening to one of their number singing a poignant ballad just before moving up to the front lines, or a man risking his life to rescue an enemy soldier from burning to death. Scenes like this remind us that even with war and death everywhere, there's still goodness and humanity to be found. Now, this kind of visual spectacle is great, but for me, a script will stand or fall based on the quality of its characters and their development, and this is another big win for 1917. Blake and Schofield are already friends at the start of the movie, which is why Schofield gets picked for the mission in the first place, but they're very different men, moulded by different experiences. Blake is young and optimistic. He hasn't seen much action yet, and he's keen to go over the top for the big push to defeat the Germans. He even uses the old "we'll be home by Christmas" line, which was probably meaningful at the start of the war, but seems kind of ridiculous by 1917. Anyway, Blake is single-minded in his determination to reach his brother and prevent the attack at any cost, causing him to take risks and act impulsively, which puts both men in danger. He's brave and compassionate, but kind of simplistic and naive in his outlook. Schofield, on the other hand, is older, more jaded and cynical. He's fought on the front lines before and knows how terrible it can be, and his experiences have made him cautious and pragmatic. He traded in his war medals for a bottle of wine, and he refuses to go home on leave because he doesn't see the point. He even expresses resentment towards Blake for landing him with a mission like this. He's no hero, he just wants to get out of this alive, and kind of sees their objective as a lost cause. But over the course of the film, he gradually becomes more invested in their mission, willing to risk his life to reach their destination, ultimately pushing himself to his mental and physical limits to deliver the message. It's a brilliant character arc that never feels manipulative or contrived, and it's helped by a standout performance by George McKay. You feel the man's growing desperation as time runs out, his grief at the slaughter all around him, and his determination not to fail. The action is sporadic and often unexpected. A lot of the time, we see the aftermath of war rather than war itself. The debris and the bodies of failed offensives, or the abandoned bunkers and destroyed artillery left behind by a retreating enemy. But when it does come, the violence hits hard and fast, and it feels grounded and believable. Men take pot shots at each other with single-shot rifles, missing more often than they hit, and flounder through wreckage and stagnant water looking for cover. World War I was a conflict without clear heroes and villains, and this kind of moral ambiguity is reflected in the film itself. Most of the time, we don't even get to see the enemy, and even when we do, it's usually half-glimpsed figures running past burning buildings at night. There's no bad guy to be defeated in this movie, which underscores the real point of this story. The only real enemy is war itself. Now, despite all the gushing I've just done, it would be unfair of me not to point out a few flaws in 1917. They're mostly small things that don't compromise the story too much, but they probably stand out for anyone who knows a bit about military history. For example, the idea of a unit advancing miles into enemy territory without reinforcements, communications, or artillery support would have been ludicrous during World War I, especially on the Western Front. This was a war where gaining 1,000 yards would have been considered a major strategic achievement. Armies moved slowly across broad fronts, usually involving hundreds of thousands of men. A single battalion would be a drop in the ocean by comparison, and they certainly wouldn't be capable of staging major attacks by themselves. At one point, Schofield hitches a ride with a unit of British trucks moving through German territory. This felt kind of weird and totally out of place. Motorised infantry transport wasn't a thing back then. Armies marched into battle just like they'd done 100 years earlier. Also, this unit somehow managed to cross no man's land into German territory. Are you telling me you managed to get transport trucks across terrain like this? Really? How? Also, what are the odds that a German fighter plane just so happens to crash into the barn where our characters are taking shelter? Wouldn't the pilot try to land in an open field instead of crashing into the only buildings for miles around? And during the final assault, the British lines are coming under heavy artillery fire before they even start the attack, but the commander still acts as if they have the upper hand. Like, why? Wouldn't the presence of heavy artillery clue you into the fact that the Germans have a well-prepared defensive position and are totally aware of what you're about to do? Anyway, this is just minor nitpicking from a drunken asshole on YouTube, and none of it should detract from the fact that 1917 is one of the best war movies I've seen in years. It's a movie that sheds light on a conflict that's become increasingly easy to forget, while managing to tell a story that's compelling and universal. It makes no attempt to glorify the war itself, but its story exemplifies the best and most noble qualities of mankind. Our bravery, our compassion, our willingness to sacrifice our lives for something bigger than ourselves. And I say mankind here for a very clear reason. 1917 is a movie about men. I'm sure that's hard for certain people to accept in today's culture, and that's just fine with me. Their anger and frustration makes me smile. But drinker, you gentlemanly scholar, I hear you say, what's about more representation? What about it? This isn't a movie that tries to rewrite history into a safe, acceptable, politically correct framework that won't trigger anyone. This is an honest story that depicts war as it was. A movie that does what it can to honour the millions of young men who lived and fought and died through the carnage of World War I, giving up their tomorrow so that we could have our today. A movie that gives us a taste of the triumphs and hardships and traumas that shaped an entire generation. And in an age when it's all too easy to forget the wars of the past and focus on the grievances and worries of the present, 1917 serves as a reminder of the quote we'd all do well to keep in mind. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Go away now.